Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition. And today we're continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. Sorry about the glare there. Okay, so the subtitle is called A Second Look at the Federal Reserve. So I wonder who did the first look. Interesting, eh? Okay, so before we begin, I want to do a little plug and then we can start our reading. If you find this helpful, you can check out our other book clubs as well. We have our spiritual book clubs on Mondays where we read spiritual books. Thursdays we have, oh, this is Thursday. Okay, never mind. Wednesdays we have our health book club, which we read about anything health related. So you could check us out there. We put all our book clubs and the past books that we've read on YouTube, so you could check us out there. I have it on a playlist, so you can just play it when you're, in the gym or exercising, taking a walk, doing chores or errands or whatever, stuck in traffic. You could listen to that there. You just have to forgive me for I'm not a professional reader. I kind of try to make it fun for me because otherwise it's going to feel like a chore and work, and I don't want to feel that. So, anyways, that's that. If you have any books that you want to recommend us to read, I'll leave a link in the description box below. And it could be anything. It could be a spiritual book or a health book or a financial book. We like to read books that have been around for a while, that have stood the test of time. I find that uh, books that have been around for a while have a lot of wisdom in them and a lot of knowledge. So that's why I like old, you know, I don't want to say ancient. Yeah, ancient, old books, old books. Books full of wisdom, let's just say that. So, anyways, I'll leave a link in the description box below and you can recommend it and we will consider it. We will read it at our discretion and we'd love to hear from you. Uh, what else? We have a monthly newsletter that we put out, so check us out there. I'll leave a link of our website. It's on our website. The newsletters has its dedicated tab where I put all our past and present newsletters, so you could check us out there. And we have regular podcasts that we put out as well. And we have a dedicated tab for that as well on our website. So um, I interview very interesting people. I think they're interesting, and we talk. There really isn't any restrictions. So I just interview people in their health journey or their spiritual journey, and some of the philosophies, some of the work that they're doing. So check us out there. And if you are local in the Los Angeles area and you want to support us, come visit us in our healing center. We have a healing center that we use technologies based on Nikola Tesla's scalar wave research for holistic healings for both domestic animals, cats and dogs, as well as humans. So you can read all about it there on our website as well. Learn more about it. And or if you're traveling to LA, come visit us. We love to meet you in person, get to know you in person. There's nothing like the energy of in-person relationships. It's very, very different than Zoom calls or electronic calls and interactions. So, anyways, if you find this helpful and you want to support us further, you can buy me a coffee. Or check out our merch. We're working on Christmas, not Christmas, but holidays, all the holidays designs. So we're always adding stuff, changing things. So check us out. Come back often to our website under boutique shop tab, and you'll see our many different designs, many different merchandises, and you can support us there. Okay, I hope that's helpful, and we love to hear from you. So if you have any comments, how we can do things better, some of your thoughts about the readings. Put it in the comment box below, and we'd love to hear from you and know what you're thinking, things like that. Okay. All right. So this is The Creature from Jekyll Island. And today we're going to be reading chapter 22, and this is part 1. So if you have a book, you could follow with us there. If not, you can follow with us here on camera. And I want to give kudos to all who have stuck with us for so long. So this is a year-long reading because this book is over 600 pages long, and we're just, you know, reading it a little bit at a time, digesting it a little bit at a time. Like they say, how do you eat a big... I was listening to Vice President J.D. Vance, and he modified a saying. You usually hear people say, how do you eat an elephant? I never liked that saying. But J.D. Vance modified it and said, how do you eat a big sandwich? So I like that. How do you eat a big sandwich? How do you read a big book? Little bit at a time, right? Little bites at a time. So this is chapter 22. And like I said, this is part 1. The creature swallows Congress. The second attempt to pass legislation to legitimize the banking cartel, the bankers' selection of Woodrow Wilson as a presidential candidate, their strategy to get him elected, the role played by Wilson to promote the cartel's legislation, the final passage of the Federal Reserve Act. The election of 1912 was a textbook example of power politics and voter deception. The Republican president, William Howard Taft, was up for re-election. Like most Republicans of that era, his political power was based upon the support of big business and banking interests in the industrial regions. He had been elected to his first term in the expectation that he would continue the protectionist policies of his predecessor, Teddy Roosevelt, particularly in the expansion of cartel markets for sugar, coffee, and fruit from Latin America. Interesting, eh? You never thought of coffee as a cartel, but it is. I know sugar is a cartel. I've heard of that. And fruit cartel, you never heard of that either as a cartel. Interesting, huh? Once in office, however, he grew more restrained in these measures and earned the animosity of many powerful Republicans. The ultimate breach occurred when Taft refused to support the Aldrich Plan. He objected not because it would create a central bank which would impose government control over the economy, but because it would not offer enough government control. He recognized that the Jekyll Island formula would place the bankers into the driver's seat with only nominal participation by the government. He did not object to the ancient partnership between monetary and political scientists, but he merely wanted a greater share for the political side. The bankers were not adverse to negotiating the balance of power, nor were they unwilling to make compromises. But what they really needed at this juncture was a man in the White House who, instead of being lukewarm on the plan, could be counted on to become its champion, and who would use his influence as president to garner support from the fence straddlers in Congress. From that moment forward, Taft was marked for political extinction. This was a period of general prosperity, and Taft was popular with the voters as well as with the rank and file party organization. He had easily won the nomination at the Republican convention, and there was little doubt that he could take the presidential election as well. Wilson had been put forth as the Democratic challenger, but his dry personality and aloof mannerisms had failed to arouse sufficient voter interest to make him a serious contender. The Bull Moose candidate. However, when Teddy Roosevelt returned from his latest African safari, he was persuaded by Morgan's deputies, George Perkins and Frank Munsey, to challenge the president for the party's nomination. When that effort failed, he was then persuaded to run against Taft as the Bull Moose candidate on the Progressive Party ticket. It is unclear what motivated him to accept such a proposition, but there is no doubt regarding the intent of his backers. They did not expect Roosevelt to win, but as a former Republican president, they knew he would split the party and by pulling away votes from Taft, put Wilson into the White House. Presidential campaigns need money and lots of it. The Republican Party was well financed, largely from the same individuals who now wanted to see the defeat of its own candidate. It would not be possible to cut off this funding without causing too many questions. The solution, therefore, was to provide the financial resources for all three candidates with special attention to the needs of Wilson and Roosevelt. Some historians, oops, sorry about that. Okay. Some historians, while admitting the facts, have scoffed at the conclusion that deception was intended. Ron Chernow says, quote, by 1924, the House of Morgan was so influential in American politics that conspiracy buffs couldn't tell which presidential candidate was more beholden to the bank, end quote. And that quote was from Chernow, page 254. Excuse me, 254. I burped my coffee. Okay, but one does not have to be a conspiracy buff to recognize the evidence of foul play. Ferdinand Lundberg tells us, quote, JP Morgan and Company played the leading role in the national election of 1912. Roosevelt's pre-convention backers were George W. Perkins and Frank Munsey. These two indeed encouraged Roosevelt to contest Taft's nomination. Munsey functioned in the newspaper field for J.P. Morgan and Company, buying, selling, creating, and suppressing newspapers from consonance with J.P. Morgan's shifting needs. Perkins resigned from J.P. Morgan and Company on January 1st, 1911, to assume a larger political role. The suspicion seems justified that the two were not over anxious to have Roosevelt win. The notion that Perkins and Munsey may have wanted Wilson to win is partly substantiated by the view that Perkins put a good deal of cash behind the Wilson campaign through Cleveland H. Dodge. Dodge and Perkins financed, to the extent of $35,500, the Trenton True American, a newspaper that circulated nationally with Wilson propaganda. Throughout the three-cornered fight, Roosevelt had Munsey and George Perkins constantly at his heels, supplying money, going over his speeches, bringing people from Wall Street in to help, and in general carrying the entire burden of the campaign against Taft. Perkins and J.P. Morgan and Company were the substance of the Progressive Party. Everything else was trimming. Munsey's cash contribution to the Progressive Party brought his total political outlay for 1912 to $229,255.72. Perkins made their joint contribution more than $500,000, and Munsey expended $1 million in cash. Additionally, to acquire from Henry Einstein the New York Press so that Roosevelt would have a New York City morning newspaper. Perkins and Munsey, as the clap, Senate Privileges and Election Committee, learned from Roosevelt himself, also underwrote the heavy expense of Roosevelt's campaign train. In short, most of Roosevelt's campaign fund was supplied by the two Morgan hatchet men who were seeking Taft's scalp. And that quote was from Lundberg, page 106 to 112. Morgan and Company was not the only banking firm on Wall Street to endorse a three-way election as a means of defeating Taft. Within the firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, Felix Wahlberg was dutifully putting money into the Republican campaign as expected, but his brother Paul Warburg and Jacob Schiff were backing Wilson, while yet another partner, Otto Kahn, supported Roosevelt. Another prominent Republicans who contributed to the Democratic campaign that year were Bernard Baruch, Henry Morgenthau, and Thomas Fortune Ryan. And that was that footnote was from Coco Triumph, page 205 to 211. And the Rockefeller, component of the cartel was just as deeply involved. William McAdoo, who was Wilson's national campaign vice chairman, says that Cleveland Dodge of Rockefeller National City Bank personally contributed $51,300, more than one-fourth the total raised from all other sources. In McAdoo's words, quote, he was a godsend, end quote. And that quote was from McAdoo, page 117. Ferdinand Lundberg describes Dodge as, quote, the financial genius behind Woodrow Wilson. Continuing, he says, quote, Wilson's nomination represented a personal triumph for Cleveland H. Dodge, director of the National City Bank, scion of the Dodge copper and munitions fortune. The nomination represented no less a triumph for Ryan Harvey and J.P. Morgan and Company, sitting with Dodge as co-directors of the National City Bank at the time were the younger J.P. Morgan, now the head of the Morgan firm, Jacob Schiff, William Rockefeller, J. Ogden Armour, and James Stillman. In short, except for George F. Baker, everyone from the Pujo Committee had turned rulers of the, quote, money trust was in this bank, end quote. And that quote was from Lundberg, page 109 to 113. Oh, sorry, 109 and 113. And so it came to pass that the monetary scientists carefully selected their candidate and set about to clear the way for his victory. The maneuver was brilliant. Who would suspect that Wall Street would support a Democrat, especially when the party platform contained this plank? Quote, we oppose the so-called Aldrich Bill, or the establishment of a central bank, and what is known as the money trust, end quote. What irony it was. The party of the working man, the party of Thomas Jefferson, formed only a few generations earlier for the specific purpose of opposing a central bank, was now cheering a new leader who was a political captive of Wall Street bankers and who had agreed to the hidden agenda of establishing the Federal Reserve System. As George Harvey later boasted, the financiers, quote, felt no animosity toward Mr. Wilson for such of his utterances as they regarded as radical and menacing to their interests. He had simply played the political game, end quote. And that was quoted by Lundberg, page 120. William McAdoo, Wilson's national campaign vice chairman, destined to become Secretary of the Treasury, saw what was happening from a ringside seat. He said, the major contributions to any candidate's campaign fund are made by men who have access to grind, and the campaign chest is the grindstone. The fact is that there is a serious danger of this country becoming a Pluto democracy, that is, a sham republic with a real government in the hands of a small clique of enormously wealthy men who speak through their money and whose influence even today radiates to every corner of the United States. Experience has shown that the most practicable method of getting hold of a political party is to furnish it with money in large quantities. In other words, bribe. This brings the big money giver or givers into close communion with the party leaders. Contact and influence do the rest. And that quote was from McAdoo, page 165 to 166. The money trust they love to hate. Roosevelt actually had very little interest in the banking issue, probably because he didn't understand it. Furthermore, in the unlikely event the blustery trust buster would actually win the election, the financier still had little to fear. In spite of his well-publicized stance of opposing big business, his true convictions were quite acceptable to Wall Street. As Chernow observed, Quote, although the Roosevelt-Morgan relationship is sometimes caricatured as that of trust buster versus trust king, it was far more complex than that. The public wrangling obscured deeper ideological affinities. Roosevelt saw trusts as natural, organic outgrowths of economic development. Stopping them, he said, was like trying to dam the Mississippi River. Both TR and Morgan disliked the rugged, individualistic economy of the 19th century and favored big business. In the sparring between Roosevelt and Morgan, there was always a certain amount of shadow play, a pretense of greater animosity than actually existed. Roosevelt and Morgan were secret blood brothers. And that quote was from Journal, page 106 to 112. It is not surprising, therefore, as Wahlberg noted in January 1912, 10 months before the election, that Teddy had been, quote, fairly won over to a favorable consideration of the Aldrich Plan, end quote. That was quoted from Wahlberg, Volume 1, page 78. Inner convictions on these issues notwithstanding, both Wilson and Roosevelt played their roles to the hilt. Privately financed by Wall Street's most powerful bankers, they publicly carried a flaming crusade against the quote money trusts from one end of the country to the other. Roosevelt bellowed that the quote issue of currency should be lodged with the government and be protected from domination and manipulation by Wall Street, end quote. And that quote was from Henry S. Commager, editor, Documents of American History, New York, F.S. Coughs and Company, 1940, page 77 to 79. And he quoted over and over again the Bull Moose Progressive Party platform, which said, quote, we are opposed to the so-called Aldrich currency bill because its provisions would place our currency and credit system in private hands, end quote. Meanwhile, at the other end of town, Wilson declared, quote, there has come about an extraordinary and very sinister concentration in the control of business in the country. The growth of our nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. This money trust, or as it should be more properly called, this credit trust, is no myth, end quote. And that quote was from, quoted by Carter Glass, Adventures in Constructive Finance, New York Doubleday, 1927, RPT report, maybe. Arno Press, a New York Times Company, 1975, page 78 to 79. Throughout the campaign, Taft was portrayed as the champion of big business and Wall Street banks, which of course he was, but so were Roosevelt and Wilson. The primary difference was that Taft, judged by his actual performance in office, was known to be such, whereas his opponents could only be judged by their words. The outcome of the election was exactly as the strategists had anticipated. Wilson won with only 42% of the popular vote, which means, of course, that 58% had been cast against him. Had Roosevelt not entered the race, most of his votes undoubtedly would have gone to Taft, and Wilson would have become a footnote. As Colonel House confided to author George Viereck years later, quote, Wilson was elected by Teddy Roosevelt, end quote. And that quote was from Viereck, page 34. Now that the creature had moved into the White House, passage of the Jekyll Island plan went into its final phase. The last bastion of opposition in Congress consisted of the populist wing of the Democratic Party under the leadership of William Jennings Bryan. The problem with this group was that they had taken their campaign platforms seriously. They really were opposed to the money trust. While it may have been a simple matter to pull the wool over the eyes of voters, it would not be so easy to fool this group of experienced politicians. What was needed now was an entirely new bill on the surface would appear to contain changes of significant magnitude to allow the brine wing to change its position. The essential features of the plan, however, must not be abandoned. And to coordinate this final strategy, the services of someone with great political skill would be essential. Fortunately for the planners, there was exactly such a man residing at the White House. It was not the President of the United States, it was Edward Mendell House. The role of Colonel House. Colonel House, who had been educated in England and whose father represented England's merchant interests in the American South, had come into public life through the London connection. It will be recalled from previous chapters that perhaps more than any other person in America, he had helped maneuver the United States into World War I on the side of a desperate Britain, and by so doing, had also rescued the massive loans to Britain and France made by the Morgan interests. Not only had he been responsible for Wilson's nomination at the Democratic Convention, but had become the president's constant companion, his personal advisor, and in many respects his political superior. It was through House and Wilson was made aware, it was through House that Wilson was made aware of the wishes of the money trust. And it was House who guided the president in every aspect of foreign and economic policy. An admiring biographer, Arthur Smith, writing in the year 1918, says that House, quotes, holds a power never wielded before in this country by any man out of office, a power greater than that of any political boss or cabinet member, end quote. That quote was from Arthur Smith, The Real Colonel House, New York, George H. Doran Company, 1918, page 14. Let's see. A more recent biographer, George Viereck, was not exaggerating when he described House as, quote, chief magistracy of the Republic, super ambassador, the pilot who guided the ship, and that those quotes are, or those names are from Viereck, page 4. Continuing, he said, quote, for 6 years, 2 rooms were at his disposal in the north wing of the White House. In work and play, their thoughts were one. House was the double of Wilson. It was House who made the slate for the cabinet, formulated the first policies of the administration, and practically directed the foreign affairs of the United States. We had indeed 2 presidents for one. The Schiffs, the Warburgs, the Kahns, the Rockefellers, the Morgans put their faith in House. When the Federal Reserve legislation at last assumed definite shape, House was the intermediary between the White House and the financiers. And that footnote was from Viereck, page 4 and 35, and page 37. Daily entries in the personal journal of Colonel House revealed the extent to which his office had become the command post for the Jekyll Island team. The following the following sample notations are typical. December 19, 1912. I talked with Paul Warburg over the phone regarding the currency reform. I told of my Washington trip and what I had done there to get it in working order. March 24, 1913. I had an engagement with Carter Glass at 5. We drove in order not to be interrupted. I spoke to the president about this after dinner and advised that McAdoo and I whip the Glass measure into final shape, which he could endorse and take to Owen, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, as his own. March 27, 1913. Mr. J.P. Morgan Jr. and Mr. Denny of his firm came promptly at 5. McAdoo came about 10 minutes afterwards. Morgan had a currency plan already formulated and printed. We discussed it at some length. I suggested he have it typewritten so it would not seem too prearranged and sent to us today. October 19, 1913. I saw Senator Reid of Missouri in the late afternoon and discussed the currency question with him. October 19, 1913. Paul Warburg was my first caller, and he came to discuss the currency measure. Senator Murray Crane followed Warburg. He has been in touch with Senators Weeks and Nelson of the Currency Committee. November 17, 1913. Paul Warburg telephoned about his trip to Washington. He is much disturbed over the currency situation and requested an interview along with Jacob Schiff and Cleveland H. Dodge. January 21st, 1914. After dinner, we, Wilson and House, went to the president's study as usual and began work on the Federal Reserve Board appointments. And those footnotes, there's a footnote on that. So those notations are found in Seymour, Volume 1, page 161 to 168. As far as the banking issue was concerned, Colonel House was the President of the United States, and all interested parties knew it. Wilson made no pretense at knowledge of banking theory. He said, quote, "The greatest embarrassment of my political career has been that active duties seem to deprive me of time for careful investigation. I seem almost obliged to form conclusions from impressions instead of from study. I wish that I had more knowledge, more thorough acquaintance with the matters involved." End quote. And that quote was from Seymour, Volume 1, page 160. To which Charles Seymour adds, quote, "Colonel House was indefat... Oh? How do you pronounce that? Fatigue. Okay, so let's deconstruct this. Fatigue, fatigable, defatigable. Okay. Colonel House was indefatigable in providing for the president the knowledge that he sought. The colonel was the unseen guardian angel of the bill. End quote. So there's a footnote about that. I bet William McAdoo, Wilson's Secretary of the Treasury, was indignant over the credit generally given to Paul Warburg for his part in the creation of the Federal Reserve because McAdoo felt he should have received the recognition. Later, he found Carter Glass similarly piqued over Seymour's interpretation of House's importance. Glass's book, Adventures in Constructive Finance, was written primarily to show that it was he, not House, who rightfully deserved such glory. But neither McAdoo nor Glass were part of the hidden power, which is the focus of this study, and neither had any inkling of who was really calling the shots. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones that are not seen, at least in public, right? That are behind the scenes, behind the curtain, underground. All right. Death of the Aldrich Plan. The first task for the Jekyll Island team was to hold a funeral for the Aldrich Plan without actually burying it. Like a fake death, right? That's funny. Professor Laughlin had come to agree with Warburg regarding the inadvisability of having Aldrich's name attached to any banking bill, especially now that the Democrats were in control of both Congress and the White House, and he was anxious to give it a new identity. Writing in the periodical Banking Reform, which was the official publication of the National Citizens League, Laughlin said, quote, "It is progress that the Aldrich Plan came and went. It is progress that people have been aroused and interested," end quote. The League was now free, he said, to, quote, "try to help in getting a proper bill adopted by the Democrats," end quote. A bill that, quote, "in non-essentials could be made different from the old plan," end quote. And those quotes are quoted by Coco Triumph, page 222. It did not take long for the Democrats to bring forth their own proposal. In fact, that process had begun even before the election of 1912. One of the most outspoken critics of the Aldrich Plan was the Democratic chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, Congressman Carter Glass from Virginia. And it was Glass who was given the responsibility of developing the new plan. By his own admission, however, he had virtually no technical knowledge of banking. To provide that expertise and to actually write the bill, he hired an economics teacher from Washington and Lee University, Henry Parker Willis. We should not be surprised to learn that Willis had been a former student and protege of Professor Laughlin and had been retained by the National Citizens League as a technical writer. Explaining the significance of this relationship, Kalko says, quote, throughout, oh, okay, throughout the spring of 1912, Willis wrote Laughlin about his work for the Glass Committee, his relationship to his superior, and Washington gossip. The advice of the old professor was much revered. When you arrive, he wrote Laughlin concerning a memorandum he had written, I should like to show it to you for such criticism as occurred to you. The student-teacher relationship between the two men was still prominent. Laughlin, Colonel House, and Glass were to frequently consult with major bankers about reform and provided an important and continuous bridge for their ideas while bills were being drafted. Colonel House, in addition, was talked to by Frick, Otto Kahn, and others in late February, and the following month also met Vanderlip, J.P. Morgan Jr., and other bankers to discuss currency reform. To make sure the reform was more to the liking of bankers, a steady barrage of personal, unobtrusive communications with Glass, House, and Wilson was kept up throughout February and March. The Citizens League was fulsome in its praise of Glass, and bankers felt greater and greater confidence as Colonel House began visiting Glass and showing interest in his currency measure. The new president admitted, quote, he knew nothing about banking theory or practice. Glass made the same confession to Colonel House in November, and this vacuum is of the utmost importance or significance, sorry. The entire banking reform movement at all crucial stages was centralized in the hands of a few men who for years were linked ideologically and personally with one another, end quote. And that quote was from Coco Triumph, page 219 to 228. Okay, let's stop there for now. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed that. Well, we will continue our reading next time. And in the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day, great afternoon, great evening, and great week. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye bye now.